people found dead inside a building on Skid Row.
LA fire officials believe all 3 deaths were due to overdoses, raising fears that a new dangerous drug may be spreading here in Southern California.
50 blocks in downtown Los Angeles house between 4,000 and 8,000 homeless people at any given time. That's the largest concentration of homelessness in the United States, packed into roughly 2.7 square miles. We're talking about an area bounded by 3rd Street to the north, 7th Street to the south, Main Street to the west, and Alameda Street to the east. Here's what makes this particularly disturbing. Skid Row sits literally in the heart of one of America's wealthiest cities. Walk one direction and you'll see corporate office towers, luxury hotels, and the financial district where billions of dollars change hands daily. Walk the other direction and you're in what looks like a third-world refugee camp with tents covering entire sidewalks and streets. The visual contrast is shocking to first-time visitors. Modern glass skyscrapers tower over blocks where hundreds of people sleep on concrete. Luxury condos selling for millions overlook encampments where families live in cardboard shelters. This isn't happening in some remote area. This is downtown, where tourists visit, where people work in offices, where the LA Live entertainment complex draws thousands. The crime statistics are brutal. Violent crime rates here dramatically exceed Los Angeles averages by significant margins. Drug-related arrests dominate police reports, with hundreds occurring monthly. Assaults, robberies, and sexual assaults happen with alarming frequency in this concentrated area. Homicides get reported regularly, with Skid Row accounting for a disproportionate share of downtown's murders. Emergency calls from Skid Row overwhelm LAPD resources. The calls never stop: overdoses, assaults, medical emergencies, disputes, welfare checks. The volume from these 50 blocks exceeds what some entire neighborhoods generate. Overdose deaths occur almost daily according to first responder reports. With fentanyl saturation in the drug supply, even experienced users miscalculate doses. Ambulances make multiple runs per hour into this zone. Paramedics know the area intimately because they're there constantly. The sheer volume of medical emergencies, violent incidents, and drug-related calls makes this area one of the most dangerous assignments for law enforcement in the entire city. And yes, even police fear entering certain parts of Skid Row. This isn't hyperbole. LAPD officers work in pairs or groups here as standard procedure, not optional backup. The combination of used needles littering the ground, unpredictable behavior from people experiencing mental health crises or drug-induced psychosis, and regular assaults on officers makes this genuinely dangerous work. Veterans of the LAPD consistently rank Skid Row among their most difficult and dangerous postings, comparing it to gang territories in terms of risk. The density of human suffering concentrated in these 50 blocks is incomparable anywhere else in America. Thousands of people living on sidewalks, in tents, in makeshift shelters constructed from tarps and shopping carts. The smell of human waste pervades certain streets. Visible drug transactions happen in broad daylight. Mentally ill individuals wander streets untreated, sometimes for years, all of this compressed into an area you could walk across in 15 minutes. These 50 blocks represent a crisis that's been building for decades. What you're about to discover about how people survive here day to day, the diseases that circulate in these encampments, and what living in a permanent tent city actually means will show you that crime statistics are just the beginning of this nightmare. The drug market in Skid Row operates openly in ways you don't see in most American cities. Methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, and crack cocaine get sold on certain street corners with minimal attempt at concealment. Dealers and users mix in the same areas, transactions happening in plain view of anyone passing by. The proximity to such readily available drugs means overdoses happen constantly throughout the day and night. Multiple overdoses in a single day isn't unusual here, it's expected. First responders deploy Narcan, the overdose reversal drug, so frequently that they go through supplies faster than almost anywhere else in the county. Paramedics carry multiple doses because one person might need several applications. The prevalence of fentanyl has made this worse because users often don't know the strength of what they're taking until it's too late. Some batches are so potent that a tiny miscalculation means death. The drug economy here operates with its own rules and hierarchies. Dealers know their customers by name. Certain corners belong to certain suppliers. Disputes over territory or debts get settled violently. The constant flow of cash and drugs creates an ecosystem where predators thrive and the vulnerable get exploited relentlessly. Violence between residents happens regularly for reasons both drug-related and personal. People get robbed of the few possessions they have, sometimes by other homeless individuals, sometimes by outsiders who target this vulnerable population, and territory gets disputed, sometimes violently, when someone sets up in another person's claimed space. Assaults over drug debts or personal conflicts are common enough that many go unreported. Sexual assault is a severe problem, particularly for women living on these streets. The numbers are likely much higher than statistics show because many victims don't report crimes. The reasons vary: distrust of police, fear of retaliation, the belief that nothing will happen anyway, or the trauma of having to relive the assault through investigation. Then there's the mental health crisis layered on top of everything else. Estimates suggest that 25 to 30% of Skid Row's population has serious mental illness. Untreated schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, and PTSD are rampant throughout the encampments. When you combine mental illness with substance abuse, which is extremely common here, you get unpredictable and sometimes dangerous situations that can escalate without warning. People experiencing psychotic episodes, paranoid delusions, or other mental health emergencies create scenarios that are difficult for anyone to handle, including trained officers and mental health professionals. The lack of psychiatric care means these conditions go untreated, often for years or even decades. Some individuals have been living on these streets with severe mental illness for so long that it's all they know. The health hazards extend far beyond crime and violence. HIV and AIDS rates among Skid Row's population are significantly higher than the general population, driven by shared needles and risky behaviors. Hepatitis A, B, and C spread through the unsanitary conditions and close quarters. Tuberculosis outbreaks have occurred here multiple times, requiring public health interventions. Skin infections from untreated wounds, respiratory diseases from exposure, and other conditions thrive in this environment where basic medical care is scarce. Rat infestations are common, with rodents feeding on garbage and spreading disease. The lack of access to bathrooms creates a sanitation nightmare that affects everyone in the area, housed and unhoused alike. Thousands of tents, makeshift shelters, and tarps cover the sidewalks and streets of Skid Row in what's become a permanent outdoor settlement. These aren't temporary camping setups that people use for a night and move on. Some of these encampments have existed in the same locations for years, becoming semi-permanent fixtures of the urban landscape. The tents range from basic camping equipment you'd buy at a sporting goods store to elaborate structures built from wood pallets, tarps, plastic sheeting, and whatever materials people can scavenge or find. Some shelters show ingenuity in their construction, with multiple rooms, weather protection, and secure storage areas. Others are barely functional, offering minimal protection from elements. Personal belongings accumulate around these shelters over time, creating serious fire hazards in areas where open flames for cooking or warmth are common. Piles of clothes, electronics, furniture, and random items stack up. Shopping carts serve as mobile storage units filled with everything a person owns and can transport. Territory within these encampments is defended, sometimes aggressively. Each tent represents someone's home, and the small space around it is their property in every meaningful sense, even if they don't legally own it. Moving someone's tent or belongings without permission can lead to serious confrontation and violence. The structures often block entire sidewalks, making them impassable and forcing pedestrians into the street. This creates safety issues for everyone, including the people living in the tents when vehicles pass too close to their shelters. Daily survival dominates the routine for most residents here. Finding food becomes the primary activity that structures each day. Missions and soup kitchens serve meals at specific times, and people plan their entire schedules around these feeding times. Miss the window, and you might not eat that day. Dumpster diving behind restaurants and grocery stores supplements these meals when available. Panhandling provides money for food or other necessities, though it's unpredictable income. Access to clean water is limited and precious. People rely on public fountains when they work, or organizations that distribute bottled water at certain times. Carrying water is difficult when you're already hauling all your possessions, so people often go without adequate hydration. Bathroom access is a major crisis that affects every aspect of life here. The lack of public restrooms leads to people urinating and defecating on the streets, in alleys, between buildings, anywhere they can find some privacy. This contributes massively to the sanitation problems and health hazards. The city has installed some portable toilets, but nowhere near enough for the population density. Bathing opportunities are rare and precious. Some missions offer showers, but access is limited to certain days and times, and often requires waiting in long lines. Going weeks without bathing is common, which contributes to health issues, skin infections, and the general degradation of physical well-being. The inability to maintain basic hygiene affects mental health and self-worth too. Doing laundry is practically impossible for most people living on the streets. Clothes get worn until they're unusable, then discarded and replaced with whatever can be found or obtained from donation centers. The sanitation crisis is visible and overwhelming to anyone who walks through. Human waste on sidewalks is a constant problem that cleaning crews struggle to keep up with. Trash accumulates faster than city workers can handle. The smell of urine, feces, and rotting garbage pervades entire blocks, particularly in summer heat. When it rains, the streets become sewage-like rivers as water mixes with waste. The term Skid Row originally came from Seattle's Skid Road, where workers skidded logs down to the waterfront in the lumber industry. LA's version started in the late 1800s as an area for transient workers during the city's early growth. Cheap hotels, rooming houses, and flop houses housed laborers working temporary jobs in construction, agriculture, and various industries that needed mobile workforces. Bars, pawn shops, employment agencies, and basic services catered to this transient population. This wasn't originally seen as a crisis or social problem. It was simply an area where working poor people lived temporarily between jobs, a normal part of the industrial economy. The population was mostly men doing manual labor, moving through the area as work became available in different parts of the region. Everything changed fundamentally with deinstitutionalization in the 1960s and 70s. Mental institutions across California began closing their doors, releasing thousands of psychiatric patients into communities. The Lanterman-Petraeus Short Act of 1967 made involuntary commitment much more difficult and kicked off this process. The promise was that community-based care would replace institutional treatment with more humane, local services. Those community services never adequately materialized. Funding didn't follow patients into communities. Outpatient clinics were insufficient. Housing wasn't provided. Many deinstitutionalized people ended up homeless within months or years of release, and Skid Row became a de facto open-air asylum. The population shifted fundamentally from transient workers to chronically homeless individuals, many with serious mental illness requiring ongoing treatment they weren't receiving. The services that did exist began concentrating in this area, which attracted more people needing help. Once word spread that Skid Row had missions, food services, and some support, people from across the region gravitated here. Then came what many observers call the containment policy, though officials would never use that term publicly. LA city officials adopted an informal strategy of concentrating homelessness in Skid Row rather than having it spread throughout the city. Social services were intentionally clustered in this zone. Police in other parts of LA would sometimes transport homeless individuals to Skid Row. Other cities allegedly did the same, giving people one-way bus tickets to Los Angeles. The logic was keeping the problem contained in one manageable zone rather than having visible homelessness spread across the city and affecting tourism, business districts, and wealthy neighborhoods. Out of sight, out of mind for most residents. This concentration made everything worse instead of better. Services attracted more homeless people to the area than they could possibly help. The density overwhelmed any capacity to actually transition people out of homelessness into stable housing. A self-perpetuating cycle established itself that continues today. The crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s devastated the already vulnerable population here. Addiction compounded mental illness. Violence increased. The opioid crisis in recent years brought fentanyl and massively increased overdose deaths. Housing costs in Los Angeles skyrocketed over decades, adding new waves of people who couldn't afford rent anywhere in the county. Economic recessions pushed more people into homelessness. The 2008 financial crisis added thousands. Gentrification of downtown LA over the past 20 years increased pressure on the area as surrounding neighborhoods developed while Skid Row remained neglected. The COVID pandemic made everything demonstrably worse. Encampments grew larger as eviction moratoriums ended and economic displacement accelerated. Services became harder to access during lockdowns. The population surged while resources remained inadequate or decreased. Decades of policy failures, economic forces, and societal choices created the Skid Row that exists today. Skid Row has more shelter beds than anywhere else in LA County, with thousands of spaces in missions and temporary facilities. Despite this concentration of resources and good intentions, an estimated 70% of the homeless population here remains unsheltered, living on the streets in tents and makeshift structures. Demand vastly exceeds capacity every single night, with shelter beds full and waiting lists extending indefinitely. Shelters have rules that, while understandable from operational perspectives, exclude many people who need help. No drugs, no alcohol, mandatory curfews, gender separation, limited storage for personal belongings. For some people dealing with active addiction, these rules make shelter impossible. For others who value their autonomy or have partners they won't separate from, the streets feel preferable to shelter restrictions. Waiting lists for permanent supportive housing stretch for years, sometimes 5 or more. By the time someone's name comes up, they may have moved, died, or given up hope. The same individuals cycle through shelters repeatedly, staying for the maximum allowed time, returning to the streets, coming back when they can. The system creates a revolving door without finding permanent solutions. Dozens of nonprofit organizations operate in Skid Row with various missions and approaches. They provide meals through soup kitchens, medical care through mobile clinics, housing assistance through case management, addiction treatment through counseling programs. Despite genuinely good intentions from dedicated staff, coordination between organizations is poor. Each operates somewhat independently with its own funding, priorities, and methods, creating fragmentation in services. A person might get food from one organization, medical care from another, housing assistance from a third, addiction counseling from a fourth. These services don't necessarily communicate or coordinate, making comprehensive support difficult. Some critics argue that the concentration of services perpetuates the problem by attracting more homeless individuals to the area from across the region and even from other states. Organizations compete for limited funding from government and private donors, which can create inefficiencies and overlap. Success rates for actually moving people out of homelessness and into stable, permanent housing remain discouragingly low despite millions spent annually. The city and county spent hundreds of millions of dollars on homelessness each year. Programs get announced with great fanfare by politicians seeking good press, then fail to implement effectively due to bureaucracy, lack of follow-through, or changing priorities. The bureaucracy itself makes it difficult for individuals to actually access services even when they theoretically exist. Applications require documentation many homeless people don't have. Appointments are difficult to make and keep without phones or transportation. Permanent supportive housing construction is painfully slow and expensive, often costing $400,000 or more per unit due to California's construction costs, regulations, and NIMBY opposition. Political administrations change every few years, killing long-term programs before they can show measurable results. What one mayor prioritizes, the next may defund. There's also what researchers call the magnet effect. The concentration of services in Skid Row attracts homeless people from across LA County and beyond. Word spreads through homeless networks about where to get food, medical care, and some support. LA's mild climate allows year-round outdoor living, unlike colder cities where winter is deadly without shelter. Some other jurisdictions have allegedly given homeless individuals one-way bus tickets to Los Angeles, exporting their problems. This continuous attraction overwhelms any capacity of existing services, no matter how many are added. Court decisions over the past 2 decades have fundamentally handcuffed law enforcement's ability to address Skid Row through traditional policing methods. Jones v. City of Los Angeles in 2006 and Martin v. City of Boise in 2018 established that criminalizing sleeping in public spaces when insufficient shelter space exists violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Police can't simply arrest people for being homeless or sleeping on sidewalks. Clearing encampments requires extensive advance notice, offers of services or shelter space, and storage of people's belongings. Since shelter space is perpetually insufficient relative to demand, meaningful enforcement becomes nearly impossible under these legal constraints. Officers often find themselves in the frustrating position of watching quality-of-life crimes occur with severely limited ability to take action. Officer safety is a genuine and documented concern in Skid Row, not exaggeration. Used needles on the ground are a constant hazard for officers working on foot. Officers have been accidentally stuck with dirty needles while searching areas or during interactions, requiring months of medical testing and profound anxiety about potential HIV or hepatitis infection. The psychological toll of that waiting period is severe. Unpredictable behavior from people high on methamphetamine, experiencing psychotic episodes, or in mental health crisis creates situations that can turn violent without warning. Officers trained in de-escalation still face scenarios where someone's mental state makes rational communication impossible. The confined spaces between tents create tactical nightmares where backup can't easily reach officers if situations turn violent. Narrow passages between encampments, limited sight lines, multiple potential threats from different directions. Assaults on police working Skid Row occur with concerning regularity, from physical attacks to thrown objects to threats with weapons. Weapons are common among residents, particularly knives carried for self-defense. While understandable given the dangers residents face from each other, these weapons also pose threats to officers trying to keep peace. Even when arrests do happen, the cycle feels futile to officers. Arrest someone for assault, drug possession, or theft, and they're often released within hours due to jail overcrowding and prosecution priorities. They're back on the same corner the next day. Prosecution of misdemeanors is extremely low priority for the district attorney's office given the volume of more serious felony crimes. Officers become demoralized by the revolving door where the same individuals get arrested repeatedly with no lasting consequences or interventions. LAPD's Central Division, which covers Skid Row and surrounding downtown, is constantly overwhelmed by call volume. The number of emergency calls from these 50 blocks is staggering relative to the geographic size. Officers respond to the same locations repeatedly, dealing with the same problems and often the same individuals in endless cycles. Community activists and homeless advocates oppose what they call criminalization of poverty, arguing that arrest and punishment don't address root causes of homelessness. But businesses trying to operate in the area and residents in surrounding neighborhoods demand safety, order, and clean streets. Officers are caught between these competing demands without clear guidance on what they're actually supposed to accomplish. The department created specialized Skid Row units with officers trained specifically in de-escalation and working with homeless populations. Mental health evaluation teams partner licensed clinicians with officers to better handle psychiatric emergencies. The focus shifted from arrests toward connecting people with services and treatment. But resources remain limited relative to massive demand, and many people refuse services when offered. Skid Row exists within miles of neighborhoods where homes routinely sell for $5, $10, $20 million or more. LA County has some of the world's wealthiest individuals, while these 50 blocks look like conditions you'd see in developing nations. The downtown development boom over the past 2 decades happened literally adjacent to tent cities, with luxury high-rises going up while encampments expanded. That contrast is perhaps the most damning aspect of this entire situation. The juxtaposition of extreme wealth and extreme poverty separated by a few blocks reveals something uncomfortable about our priorities and values as a society. The resources clearly exist to solve this problem if we chose to deploy them. The political will doesn't exist, and that's a choice. Compare LA County's annual budget, which exceeds $40 billion, with credible estimates of what it would cost to house all the county's homeless population. The math shows it's economically feasible. The fact that it doesn't happen reveals it's a political choice, not an economic impossibility. Each decision that created and perpetuates Skid Row was an active choice by policymakers and society. Deinstitutionalization without adequate community-based support systems was a policy choice made knowingly. Defunding mental health care over decades was a budgetary choice. Allowing housing costs to skyrocket without meaningful intervention or rent control was a choice. Choosing criminalization and containment over treatment and housing was a choice. Concentrating the problem geographically instead of addressing it comprehensively was a deliberate strategy. Every generation of political leaders has kicked this can down the road, prioritizing short-term political expediency over long-term solutions that might not show results within their terms in office. These aren't natural disasters happening to us beyond our control. They're the direct, predictable results of active policy decisions we've made collectively. The not-in-my-backyard reality ensures nothing fundamental changes. Wealthier neighborhoods with political power successfully resist homeless shelters, supportive housing, and services in their areas through zoning battles, lawsuits, and political pressure. Political power concentrates in communities that don't want to see or deal with this problem directly. Skid Row serves an actual function in this system. It keeps homelessness concentrated and out of sight for most residents and visitors. The geographic containment allows most people to avoid confronting the crisis. Proposed solutions like scatter-site housing in other neighborhoods face fierce opposition from residents who don't want these problems visible in their communities. This resistance ensures Skid Row continues being the dumping ground. Until all neighborhoods accept some shared responsibility and allow services and housing in their areas, nothing fundamental will change. The geographic segregation of poverty allows complacency. Housing-first approaches, which provide permanent housing without preconditions and then wrap services around people, have shown documented success in other cities and countries. Massive investment in accessible mental health care could help thousands. Truly accessible drug treatment without barriers could reduce overdoses and associated crime. But these solutions require sustained funding commitments that extend beyond election cycles and political will that prioritizes long-term outcomes over short-term optics. They require acknowledging that current approaches have catastrophically failed. The question isn't whether we can solve this, the capacity exists. The question is whether we're willing to make the choices and allocate the resources required. Skid Row might serve a purpose in maintaining the status quo, providing a place to concentrate problems we'd collectively rather ignore than address comprehensively. 50 blocks of concentrated human suffering that we as a society have decided to tolerate. The continued existence of Skid Row is a moral choice we make daily.